All right, get ready, everyone, because today we're setting sail for adventure, diving deep into the life and legend of Anne Bonny.
She's one of the most famous female pirates in history.
Absolutely. And we're here to separate fact from fiction. What do we really know about Anne Bonny versus all the stories and myths?
Right, because there's a lot out there, and separating the truth from the tall tales can be tricky.
It really can, especially when you consider that a lot of what we think we know comes from a general history of the pirates by Captain Charles Johnson. But that source, well, let's just say it needs to be handled with care.
It does indeed. Johnson's book, fascinating as it is more of a collection of colorful pirate biographies than a strictly accurate historical document.
Colorful is one way to put it. So with that in mind, let's get into it. What do we actually know about Anne Bonny's early life?
Well, even her birth date and where she was born, those are still debated.
Really? We don't even have those basics nailed down.
We don't. There's nothing in primary sources, not even her trial transcript, that confirms those details.
Wow. You'd think something like where she was born would be a matter of public record.
You'd think so, right. But instead, we have Johnson's version of her life, which claims she was born in Ireland, the illegitimate daughter of an attorney and his servant.
Okay, already sounds a little bit like a soap opera, doesn't it?
It does, and it gets more dramatic. Johnson goes on to describe her cross-dressing as a clerk, her fiery temper, even a tendency towards violence.
It's a wild story.
It is, and without much to back it up.
Makes you wonder if Johnson was maybe, shall we say, embellishing a bit to sell more books?
It's entirely possible. Remember, back then, pirate stories were popular entertainment. Adding some drama, especially about a woman challenging societal norms, well, that would have made for a more exciting read.
So true. So if we take Johnson's account with a grain of salt, what about her parents? Did he get that part right at least?
Well, about that, Johnson spins quite a yarn, a stolen spoon scandal.
A spoon? Seriously?
That's what he claims. Then there are conveniently timed deaths, and a sudden career change. The attorney turns into a plantation owner in the Carolinas.
That's like something out of a stage play.
Exactly. And the kicker is, none of this is supported by historical records that we've been able to find.
It really shows you how quickly legends can take over, even when there's someone like Anne Bonny, a real historical figure.
Absolutely. And it makes our job of figuring out what's true even more important.
It does. So how do we even begin to unravel the truth about Anne Bonny's life as a pirate? Where does fact really begin?
Well, we have to go to a 1720 proclamation issued by Governor Rogers of the Bahamas. This document basically put a bounty on the heads of Anne Bonny, John Calico Jack Rackham, that's the pirate captain she's most associated with, and Mary Read, another notorious female pirate.
Okay, so this proclamation makes it official. They were wanted criminals.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that the proclamation directly identifies both Bonny and Read as women.
Really? So they weren't trying to hide their gender?
Not at all. Which actually debunks that whole later idea of them cross-dressing to conceal their identities on board a ship.
Wow. So they were women in what was very much a man's world, and they were still making waves, causing chaos. That says a lot about them.
It really does. But if we want to get a clearer picture of what Anne Bonny was really like, we've got to go beyond Johnson's stories. We need to look at eyewitness accounts of her time as a pirate. And there's one in particular that paints a very vivid picture.
Let me guess. It doesn't exactly match the romanticized image we often see in movies and books.
Not quite. During a raid on a sloop, one of the victims, a woman named Dorothy Thomas, described seeing Bonny firsthand wielding a machete and a pistol. Now, she was wearing men's clothing, which wasn't uncommon for female pirates. But Thomas's account goes out of its way to mention a noticeable largeness of their breasts.
Now, that's a detail you wouldn't get in a romanticized version of the story.
Exactly. It reminds us that Bonny was a real person in a very rough and tumble world. These details matter. They bring us closer to the reality behind the legend.
It seems like with every little bit of information we uncover about Anne Bonny, the mystery just gets deeper and deeper. It makes you wonder, will we ever really know the woman behind the legend?
And maybe that's part of what makes her story so enduring, right? The mystery, the contradictions, trying to figure out what's true and what's been embellished, that's all part of what makes her so fascinating.
It definitely keeps things interesting. So if she's sailing with Calico Jack, what do we know about their relationship? Was it this grand love affair like so many stories suggest?
Well, their relationship is a perfect example of how tricky it can be to separate fact from the fantasy, especially with these larger-than-life historical figures.
You're saying it wasn't some epic pirate romance. No whirlwind love affair on the high seas.
If we stick to what the primary sources tell us, even something like a trial transcript, there's no mention of any romance between Bonny and Rackham.
So that whole lovers on the run image, that came later. Someone's embellishment.
Exactly. It's fascinating how stories can morph and change over time as they get passed along. But hey, speaking of stories, let's dive into the next chapter, their capture.
Okay, this does have all the makings of a good pirate movie. Set the scene for us. What went down?
Picture this. It's October 1720, they're sailing off the coast of Jamaica, and suddenly, Jonathan Barnett appears, a privateer working for the governor of Jamaica, no less, and he manages to catch Rackham's ship.
Hold on, back up. Privateer. For those of us who don't have our sea legs, what exactly does that mean?
Good point. A privateer was basically like a private citizen or their ship, given permission by a government to go after enemy ships, capture them, usually for a cut of whatever they had loot.
So, kind of like legal piracy, but with the government's blessing.
You could put it that way. But there were supposed to be rules, a certain code of conduct they had to follow. Of course, out in the Caribbean, things could get a little blurry between privateering and outright piracy.
I can imagine. The Caribbean was like the Wild West of the seas back then. So what about Bonny and Rackham? Was it a fight to the death? Walk the plank?
Well, turns out their capture wasn't quite as dramatic as you might imagine. Some accounts say that a few of the crew were ready to go down swinging, maybe even Bonny and Reed among them. But supposedly Rackham and most of his men weren't so keen on a big fight.
Sounds like maybe they'd gotten a little too used to the good life from all that plundering.
Could be. Whatever the reason, they ended up captured and taken back to Jamaica to stand trial. And that brings us to one of the most famous parts of their story.
The trial. This is where we get to the whole pleading the belly thing, right? Always makes you think of that phrase.
That's the one. So both Bonny and Reed, they're sentenced to hang. But then, in a pretty incredible turn of events, they both pleaded their bellies.
So claiming to be pregnant as a way to avoid immediate execution. But was that really a thing back then? Seems a bit convenient.
It was actually a recognized legal move in those days. The thinking was that an unborn child shouldn't face punishment for what their mother did. It was a temporary reprieve, bought them some time at least.
And in Anne Bonny's case, how much time did it end up buying her?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Sadly, for Mary Reed, it didn't last. She died in prison just a few months later. We even have records of her burial. But Anne Bonny, she basically vanishes from the history books at that point.
So the woman who seemingly cheated death once, then disappears from the historical record entirely. Did she escape? It really is like she pulled off one last great escape, this time from history itself. Did she just vanish into thin air? No trace?
Well, not exactly thin air. More like that's where the solid facts end and the speculation really kicks into overdrive. See, even Johnson's account of what happened to her after the pregnancy plea is frustratingly vague. He just mentions these reprieves she was granted, but nothing concrete about what ultimately happened to her.
Typical. Leave us hanging with more questions than answers. That feels very on brand for a pirate story, though, doesn't it?
It does, doesn't it? And that unanswered question has been keeping people guessing for centuries, which has led to, as you might expect, a whole slew of theories and claims about what became of Anne Bonny.
All right, I can't take it anymore. Lay it on me. What kind of theories? Did she live to sail another day? Did she find some quiet little corner of the world and settle down?
Well, there are those who claim that she was eventually released, lived out the rest of her days in peace even. Some accounts even say she reconciled with her father.
Now that's a dramatic ending fit for a woman who seemed to defy expectations every step of the way. I can almost picture it.
It's a good story, it really is. But I use the word claim for a reason, because as much as some people want to believe it, there's really no historical evidence to back up those happy endings.
So, no fairy tale ending, or at least not one we can definitively prove. It's kind of wild, even with relatively recent history, the truth can be so hard to pin down.
It really is. And it just goes to show how important it is to keep a critical eye when you're exploring history even, or maybe especially when it comes to captivating figures like Anne Bonny.
Well said. We can let ourselves be swept up in the excitement of the story, but we also have to stay grounded in the facts, or at least what we can actually confirm.
Absolutely.
Speaking of captivating stories, even with all the unknowns surrounding her life, there's no denying Anne Bonny's status as a legend. Why do you think her story, in particular, continues to resonate with people even centuries later? What is it about her?
It's a good question, and a complicated one for sure. But I think a large part of it is how she just completely rejected what was expected of women back then, openly living and thriving in the world of piracy, which was so male-dominated. She represents a kind of rebellion of freedom, and I think that idea still speaks to people today.
Then she wasn't just along for the ride, she was successful at it. You don't often hear about a woman commanding that much respect and fear on the high seas.
That's the thing. She was operating outside the law, absolutely, but her story, even with all its mysteries, makes us question those traditional roles, those lines we draw about what's acceptable behavior for men and women. And sometimes those lines are pretty arbitrary when you really look at them.
It really makes you wonder, what would Anne Bonny think about all this?
Hmm.
About how her story has been told and retold, celebrated, and maybe even distorted over the years.
Right. If we could sit down with her, would she be happy with how her legend has unfolded? Would she laugh at all the embellishments? Or would she be frustrated by how much of her life has been romanticized, fictionalized?
It's a question we may never know the answer to, but it's definitely one worth thinking about. It's a good reminder that history isn't just dates and names in a textbook. It's made up of real lives, each one complex and messy and full of their own motivations and desires, their own truths. And sometimes the most compelling stories are the ones where we have to fill in the blanks ourselves, use our own judgment to figure out what's real and what's been spun into legend. And with someone like Anne Bonny, the line can be pretty blurry. But that's what makes it so much fun to dig into these stories, to keep exploring, keep asking questions. And who knows, maybe one day we'll uncover another piece of the puzzle, add another layer to the legend of Anne Bonny.